You have been fighting for social justice most of your life. What made you do that?
I think it was definitely my background. I was brought up in South Wales, where my father was a former coal miner. Both my parents left school at 12 during the First World War, and my father became a glass blower, but he went down the pit as soon as he could at the age of 14. My mother was of Spanish gypsy stock, and she's a very interesting woman. I was born into a family where we were very, very poor. We lived in the worst part of the village, a place called Cumbran, which is now a new town. We had no hot water. The landlord never did any repairs to the terraced house that we lived in. We had a tap outside. Our bathroom was what we called a hanging bathroom, which was a tub on a wall which used to come in nightly for my father, but I could only bath on a Saturday evening. Now, my father was a communist, and after the general strike in 1926, no one would employ him because he was blacklisted. And I said to my mother, "Ma'am, why did our Gwen go away?" And she used a Victorian expression. Well, they said it was failure to thrive, Keith. And what that meant was she wasn't getting the correct food. My mum wanted me to go to chapel, so there was a chapel called Pen o' Wine, chapel in the field. And my father gave permission for me to go there because the minister had been a Labour MP twice. I was very badly behaved, but it was a school where corporal punishment was always administered. And the main teacher I had was a horrible man who used to smoke in class, come in the morning, we all had to march in, line up in the yard, march in, sit down at our desk. One day, I was a bit late getting into line in the yard, and he kicked me up the backside, and he really hurt me. And my mother's friend saw him kick me up the backside. Half an hour later, I heard my mother's voice in the corridor saying, "Where is he?" And in she stormed, hit him over the head with her umbrella, his glasses smashed, and the headmaster had to rushed in and pulled my mother off. Amazing thing happened. I stayed with the chapel, and when I was about 12, 13, I was taken by my mother, because the headmaster suggested it, to a place called Caerleon, which was a Roman fortress called Iscasilo, very more important than London in Roman times. And I sat in a room at a desk with about 100 people. And I had this examination paper put in front of me, so I just answered it. I can remember composing a small poem. I don't know what happened about the 11 plus. I never took it because I was 12, 13 when I did this. And 3 months later, I was stood with my face to the wall. And if I'd have dropped my hands, he would have whacked me across the back with a cane. And the headmaster came in and said, "Well, I have to announce some good news. Tom's has won a scholarship to the school, which was quite a distance from my home." And he gave me this letter and said, "Go home and give this to your mother, to your parents." So I ran all the way home, and when I got home, my mother, who found it a bit difficult to read, and when I read it to her and it sank in, she was up and down the road, our street, knocking on the doors and saying, "Our Keith has won a scholarship to this grammar school in Aberystwyth." My first encounter with a black person was when I was about 5, because we all used to wander around, and the boys were swimming in the canal, and I'd have jumped in or fell in, and of course it was out of my depth, and I was floundering around there, and I probably would have drowned if I hadn't been careful, if this bloke hadn't appeared. And this black soldier hauled me out and said, "You're a silly boy," and put me on the side of the bank and then pushed off because he was walking from the camp into the village to do some shopping.
So you experienced deprivation and injustice, and then you came about 50 years ago, you came to England for education and scholarship. Then you became quite involved in active politics, like you were part of the Socialist Party, you were part of the Communist Party, and you became involved in trades union activities. What made you so active in challenging, again, social injustice, but through these structures?
I mean, my background was a formulating influence on me. My minister in the chapel, who had been, as I said, a Labour MP twice, was an amazing man. Now, when I came here, I was lucky enough to meet my wife. We went to work in the East End of London in a place called Hoxton, which has now become gentrified, but was one of the roughest areas in London. Now, I saw poverty and I saw deprivation, and I'd experienced it, although I was lucky to be born into a household that really considered education important. And I listened to debates in that household. So that was a formulating influence on my life. So I had a sort of Christian side of it through my minister and my dad. And I couldn't stand seeing things that were wrong. Now, I saw through my politics a structure whereby society could be changed. My life was formulated on the basis of, I suppose you could say, protest. Now, having done that, I went to a poverty-stricken area in 1961 in the East End of London as my first teaching appointment to teach history. I was in the Communist Party, which I joined when I was doing my teacher training. And I lived in a place called Stepney, which is now part of Tower Hamlets. We got married, my wife and I, and the social concern that my wife's parents, who lived in Lancaster Road, North Harrow, showed rubbed off on my wife, and so we both were concerned. My wife taught in Hackney, and we started working there. Now, we were also, while I was in the Communist Party, it was Oswald Mosley of the British Union of Fascists was still active. And so we used to steal his pitch in Ridley Road, Dalston, and speak from 9 o'clock in the morning as youngsters on a Sunday. There were fights with fascists there, and I was actually involved in that. So you're talking about working class background, you're talking about politically active family, who experienced going through the poverty of the 30s, and I was at the tail end of that. But what you actually did was give me an education which provided me with not just a practical basis, but an intellectual basis for attempting to change society.
Now you are an honorary alderman in Harrow. How does it fit in the politics which does not always sit well with social justice?
It's difficult because I was made an honorary alderman, right? The system means that it's a title that can be given under the 1972 Act. I'm still a socialist. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a Marxist. I really believe, history is on the side, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was never a socialist country anyway. It also helps people to look at me and perhaps pay a bit more attention to the politics that I'm pushing. I'll never change, but people know I'll never change. And perhaps they look at me to give a degree of stability as well. I know there's one thing, that there's only one race in this world, and it's called the human race, and we're all part of it. And the great thing about genotyping is, has proved that fundamentally there's no essential difference between us. I have had lots of ill health and operations. 5 of the major operations that I have had have been performed by people from an ethnic minority.
you grew up in a political era where the politics was driven by certain ideologies, creating a variety in the politics. How do you see the present politics?
I become very sad because what we've actually seen is almost a coalescence of lots of ideas between the major parties. And what is really strong is, for me, what I think has happened is, from my standpoint, is the extent that the media, etc., has demonised the poor and people that are unemployed and people that are on welfare benefits. I mean, 53% of those that receive welfare benefits are people that are actually in work, and employers not paying the wages, so the taxpayer is subsidising not the workers but the employers. And I honestly feel that, well, I'll be straight with you, I don't think there's any party that represents the poor.
Given the system as it is, which you have described, it is very difficult to achieve justice and equality under the present circumstances. What do you think is the way forward?
The way forward is to face up to the reality that, however much some people are not prepared to accept it, is that everybody has a role to play and no one is better than another person. So many people are dying of starvation in this world. Right? How in heaven's name? There's a difference between wants and needs. Right? We shouldn't satisfy wants to the extent that we do when there are other people who have needs. Spend enormous amounts of money invading Iraq and various other countries, destabilizing and leaving a mess there when we leave. And it's the poor people that are going to suffer. We need to equalise out. And in doing that, we also need to combat any racism that we see. Because what racists don't realise is that they're denying themselves the benefit of the people they discriminate against, who could do a great deal to help them. What we're really talking about is a fundamental change in the attitudes of people. But how can we change the attitudes in people when most of the people that control the media live in other countries? Perhaps the future lies with our kids, right? Perhaps that's what we should be doing. Because I think my generation have got a deep-seated racism in them. Poverty, right, has no colour because it crossed the dividing line. You can say to yourself, right, that someone who's poor and white working class is disadvantaged, but you can't say with every degree of certainty if you're black, working class and poor, you're doubly disadvantaged.
You have been a councillor for more than 32, 33 years. Now, Harrow profile has changed quite a lot during that time. Do you think that the system and within that the service providers have properly, adequately acknowledged that change and have responded accordingly?
In certain areas they might have, right? But in other areas, I think there is a need for a more constructive approach. Like I've said, what we've got to do is ensure that equality of provision is provided in all areas, irrespective of ethnicity and irrespective of socioeconomic class. I know that we have a wonderful National Health Service. I know that poverty of the sort that I saw, and which was even worse that my sister saw, is not there, but poverty is still there. And the other thing is that we really, really, really do need to examine all our structures to see that they're more responsive. And I'm very much afraid that this concentration, for example, on the term people coming from other countries and stealing, oh God, stealing our jobs, etc., is only fueling, and when newspapers have headlines that are so scurrilous about particular groups, then that puts the clock back.
Are there any things that you wanted to do but have not been able to do?
I don't think I've been able to get my views over in a way in which more people have understood them. I wish probably that I'd have been more persuasive. I'm more of a combatant than a persuader, and I wish I'd have been the other way round.